And with this signature, the future of the Sterling Empire will officially be placed into the hands of a true genius. My father's voice, amplified by the speakers, boomed across the grand ballroom. The sound echoed off the crystal chandeliers and the gold leaf ceilings, a pronouncement of my own social execution. Hundreds of guests, the city's elite, erupted in thunderous applause. They were celebrating the coronation of my older brother Ethan, and I was just a ghost at the feast, a witness to my own erasure. From the stage, my father, Robert Sterling, was the very picture of power. At 60, his posture was rigid, his suit immaculate, his gaze sweeping over the adoring crowd with an air of absolute authority. Beside him stood Ethan. My brother at 28 was everything I wasn't. He was tall, confident, and radiated an effortless charisma that drew people to him like moths to a flame. His new MBA from Harvard was just another jewel in a crown he had been born to wear. He accepted the applause with a practiced, humble nod, but I could see the triumphant glint in his eyes. He had won. He had always won. I stood near the back of the room, partially hidden behind a marble pillar, the crisp linen of my ill-fitting tuxedo feeling like a costume. I watched the scene unfold on the stage, a brilliant, painful spectacle of light and success. The spotlights made them shine, made them seem almost godlike, while I was left in the shadows. Every clap, every cheer felt like a shovelful of dirt being thrown onto my coffin. It wasn't just that Ethan was inheriting the company Sterling Industries, our family's legacy worth hundreds of millions. It was the public declaration that I was nothing. I had been weighed, I had been measured, and I had been found wanting. My entire life had been a quiet, desperate audition for a role I was never meant to have, and this was the final brutal casting notice. A waiter rushed past his tray laden with champagne flutes, not even registering my presence. I was so used to being invisible that I had perfected the art of it. I kept my shoulders hunched, my eyes downcast, my presence minimized to the point of non-existence. It was a survival mechanism I had learned as a child, the only way to avoid the constant painful comparisons to my brilliant older brother. Ethan was the sun around which our family orbited, and I was just a distant, forgotten planet, cold and lightless. Just then I felt a sharp, familiar touch on my arm. My mother Helen had materialized beside me. She looked radiant in her emerald gown, her smile perfectly polished for the guests, but her eyes when they met mine were as cold and hard as steel. She leaned in close, her voice a low, venomous whisper that was for me and me alone. "Don't make that face, Leo. Today is your brother's day." It wasn't a word of comfort. It was a command. An order to swallow my disappointment, to hide my pain, to not dare tarnish this perfect moment with my pathetic sorrow. She didn't see a heartbroken son. She saw a potential embarrassment, a loose thread in the flawless tapestry of her family's success. She adjusted the collar of my jacket with a dismissive tug, her touch lingering for a moment too long, a silent reminder of my place. Then just as quickly as she appeared, she was gone, gliding back into the crowd, her perfect smile restored, leaving me alone with the fresh sting of her words. Her message was clear: your feelings do not matter. Your existence is an inconvenience. Stand here and be quiet. And so I did, just as I had always done. I stood in the shadows and watched as my father prepared to sign away my future, a silent testament to a life lived in the margins. I tried to make myself smaller, to shrink into the shadows of the pillar, hoping the darkness would swallow me whole, but it was useless. Across the crowded room, through the sea of smiling faces and glittering jewels, his eyes found mine. It wasn't an accident. With Ethan, it never was. It was a deliberate, calculated act of predation. He had been scanning the crowd not for admirers, but for me. He needed to see my face in his moment of triumph. My defeat was the secret ingredient that made his victory taste so sweet. For a long, agonizing moment, he just stared. The noise of the party seemed to fade away, replaced by the deafening roar of my own pulse in my ears. Then the corner of his mouth twitched upwards, forming a slow, cruel smirk. It was a look I knew better than my own reflection, a look of absolute soul-crushing superiority. It was the same smirk he gave me when he won the state swimming championship, the same one he wore when he got the Ivy League acceptance letter, the same one he flashed every time our father praised him while ignoring my very existence. It was a smirk that said, "You see, I am everything, and you are nothing. And we both know it." Then he moved. Slowly, with the theatrical grace of a conquering king, he raised his champagne flute. It wasn't a toast to the room or to our father. It was a toast to me. The gesture was a masterpiece of silent mockery. It was a salute to the family's designated failure, a toast to the brother who would forever live in his shadow. The light from the chandeliers caught the crystal glass, making it sparkle, a beacon of my humiliation for the whole world to see, even if only he and I understood its true meaning. He held it there for a moment, his eyes locked on mine, a silent challenge, a final twist of the knife. And in that gesture I saw it all: pity, contempt, and the sheer, unadulterated pleasure of his dominance. He was not just my brother. He was my keeper, the architect of my insignificance. A hot wave of shame and anger washed over me, so intense it made my vision blur. My hands hidden in my pockets clenched into fists so tight my knuckles turned white. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to do something, to shout, to throw a glass, to shatter the perfect, polished facade of this celebration. But I was paralyzed. What could I possibly do? Years of conditioning, of being told to be quiet, to not make a scene, to not upset the delicate balance of our family's carefully constructed image, had left me powerless. I was a puppet whose strings had been cut, a soldier who had forgotten how to fight. The humiliation was a physical thing, a heavy cloak that suffocated me, pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. I had to get out. The air in the ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and unspoken condescension. I couldn't stand it for another second. I tore my gaze away from Ethan's mocking face and turned my body, moving on autopilot, my only goal to reach the exit and escape into the cold, anonymous night. I didn't care where I went as long as it was away from here, away from them. But as I turned, my eyes caught a final devastating detail on the stage. My father, Robert, had picked up a sleek black fountain pen. He smiled, a proud, beaming smile directed at Ethan, a smile I had never once received. And next to the pen, lying open on the mahogany podium, was a thick portfolio of documents. The transfer papers. The legal instrument of my complete and utter disinheritance. My father tapped the pen on the podium, the small clicking sound lost in the applause, but to me, it was as loud as a gunshot. It was a countdown, a ticking clock marking the final seconds of my connection to the Sterling legacy. With a single fluid stroke of that pen, my fate would be sealed. My invisibility would become permanent, legally binding. The small, desperate hope I hadn't even realized I was clinging to, the childish fantasy that maybe, just maybe, I hadn't been completely forgotten, died in that instant. The smirk from my brother was an insult. The document on the stage was an execution order. I had to leave. Now. Just as I reached the grand archway leading out of the ballroom, a hand surprisingly strong clamped down on my arm. I flinched, expecting a security guard, but when I turned I saw a familiar face, though one I hadn't seen in years. It was Mr. Hayes, my grandfather's personal lawyer and oldest friend. He must have been in his late 70s, but the eyes that peered at me from behind thick glasses were sharp and full of a desperate, fiery light. His normally immaculate gray suit was slightly disheveled, and he was breathing heavily as if he had run all the way here. He looked frantic, his gaze darting back toward the stage and then fixing on me with an intensity that pinned me to the spot. "You can't leave," he said, his voice a hoarse, urgent whisper that cut through the background hum of the party. He clutched my arm tighter, his knuckles white. "I got here as fast as I could. You are not allowed to walk out that door." Confusion warred with my desperate need to escape. "Mr. Hayes, what are you talking about? I have to go." I tried to pull my arm away, but his grip was like iron. "No," he insisted, shaking his head, his silver hair falling across his forehead. "You don't understand. This is what your grandfather James wanted you to have." From his inside jacket pocket, he produced a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was sealed with a wax stamp bearing my grandfather's family crest, an emblem I hadn't seen since his funeral. He thrust it into my free hand. It felt heavy, substantial, a solid piece of a past I thought was long buried. I stared at it, then back at his pleading face. A bitter, hopeless laugh escaped my lips. "It's too late, Mr. Hayes. Did you not hear him? It's all going to Ethan. It's over." The finality of my own words tasted like ash in my mouth. What could this possibly change? A sentimental letter, a final posthumous piece of advice. It was meaningless now. Mr. Hayes leaned in closer, his voice dropping even lower, filled with a conviction that momentarily silenced my despair. "It is never too late for the truth, Leo," he hissed, his eyes blazing. "Your grandfather was a brilliant man. He saw everything. He knew this day would come. He made provisions." He gestured wildly with his head toward the stage where my father was still basking in the glow of the applause, the pen still in his hand. Now, for God's sake, read it. And you must stop him before he puts that pen to paper." His words hung in the air, a crazy, impossible command. Me. Stop my father. The idea was so alien, so contrary to the entire dynamic of my life that I couldn't even process it. But before I could respond, a new, more immediate threat appeared. From across the room I saw Ethan's expression change. His triumphant smirk had vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating frown. He had seen the entire exchange. He had seen Mr. Hayes, a man he knew was loyal only to our grandfather, and he had seen the official-looking envelope being passed to me. He didn't shout. He didn't cause a scene. He was too smart for that. Instead, with a barely perceptible flick of his eyes and a slight, almost invisible nod, he dispatched his own private army. 2 men built like mountains in tailored black suits detached themselves from the wall. They weren't the venue's security. They were Ethan's men, the kind of personal security that came with being the heir to a fortune. They began to move toward me, not with the hurried pace of a guard breaking up a fight, but with the slow, deliberate, and terrifying purpose of predators closing in on their prey. They navigated the crowd effortlessly, their broad shoulders parting the sea of guests, their eyes locked on me. Panic cold and sharp shot through me. My first instinct, the one honed by 25 years of avoidance, screamed at me to run. The exit was right there, just a few feet away. I could be gone before they even reached me out into the night, away from this gilded cage. I could take the envelope, read it in the privacy of my own lonely apartment, and live with the ghost of what might have been. It would be the safe choice, the easy choice, the choice I had made my entire life. I looked at the heavy doors of the exit, then down at the envelope in my hand. The wax seal felt warm beneath my thumb. "Stop him," Mr. Hayes had said. The words echoed in my mind, colliding with a lifetime of my father's dismissals, my mother's commands to be silent, and my brother's endless casual cruelty. I could feel the weight of all those moments, all those insults, all those years of being made to feel small and worthless, and for the first time something inside me broke. It wasn't despair, it was rage, a quiet burning rage against the injustice of it all. I thought of my grandfather, the only person who had ever looked at me and not seen a disappointment, the only one who taught me to play chess, who told me that sometimes the quietest piece on the board could be the most powerful. This envelope, this last message from him, felt like his hand on my shoulder, a final move in a game he had been playing all along. The security guards were closer now, only 20 feet away. Ethan was watching, a confident smirk returning to his face, certain that his weak, pathetic little brother would do exactly as expected and flee. But he was wrong. In that instant, a lifetime of flight came to an end. I looked at Mr. Hayes, gave him a single determined nod, and turned my back on the exit. I turned my back on safety. I turned my back on the person I used to be. Clutching the envelope so tightly my knuckles ached, I began to push my way back into the crowd, back into the heart of the party, my eyes fixed on the stage. The chase was on. It was no longer a chase to escape, but a race to confront, a race to the truth. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't running away. I was running toward the fight. Dodging a cluster of laughing guests, I shoved my way through a thick velvet curtain, finding myself in a blessedly quiet, dimly lit service corridor. The sounds of the party were instantly muffled, replaced by the low hum of a ventilation system. I leaned against the cool wall, my heart hammering against my ribs, the heavy envelope clutched in my hand. I could hear the approaching footsteps of the security guards, their heavy tread echoing on the marble floor just outside the corridor. I didn't have much time. My fingers, clumsy with adrenaline, fumbled with the seal. I didn't bother to open it neatly. I tore it open, a ragged, desperate rip that felt like a severance from my old life. Inside there were 2 items. The first was a single sheet of thick, expensive paper folded in half. It wasn't a complex legal document, but a handwritten letter. I recognized the strong, elegant cursive immediately. It was my grandfather's. Seeing his handwriting after so many years was like a punch to the gut, a sudden sharp pang of grief and love. My eyes scanned the words, his voice echoing in my memory as if he were standing right beside me. The message was short, cryptic, and utterly maddening. It read, "Leo, my boy. They think my legacy is a company, a collection of buildings and bank accounts. They are wrong. My greatest asset isn't in the Sterling Industries portfolio, it is in your courage. The courage that has been tempered by silence, tested by disrespect, and strengthened by adversity. This is your inheritance. Now use it." That was it. I read it again, and then a third time, a wave of confusion and bitter disappointment crashing over me. Courage. What was I supposed to do with that? Was this some kind of cruel joke? I needed a legal document, a stay of execution, something to prove my father was wrong. Instead, my grandfather had left me a Hallmark card sentiment. He had left me a riddle while my world was burning down. It was beautiful. It was poetic, and it was utterly, completely useless. The anger I had felt before returned, now tinged with a sense of betrayal. He had seen this coming, and this was his solution. A pat on the back from beyond the grave. My hand crumpled the letter in my fist, a surge of despair making my knees feel weak. It was over. I had been a fool to hope for even a second. Then my fingers brushed against the second item in the envelope. It was cold hard and heavy. I pulled it out. It was a single old-fashioned key. It wasn't a modern key for a house or a car. It was made of ornate brass with a complex, intricate head and a number stamped into its base. It was a safe deposit box key. This was something tangible, something real, but it only deepened the mystery. The box could be anywhere. And even if I found it, what good would it do me right now? I risked a glance back into the ballroom through a crack in the curtains. My blood ran cold. The scene was frozen in a perfect, horrible tableau. My father Robert was standing at the podium, his speech concluded. The applause was dying down. He was smiling, basking in the adoration of the crowd. And in his hand, the black fountain pen was no longer resting. It was poised directly above the signature line of the transfer document. He was moments away, seconds away from making it all official. The ticking clock wasn't ticking anymore. It was a screaming siren in my head. My mind raced frantically, trying to piece together the puzzle. A letter about courage, a key to an unknown box, and a ticking clock that had all but run out. It made no sense. It was hopeless. And then as my panic reached its peak, a memory surfaced unbidden from the deep recesses of my mind. It was so clear, so vivid, it felt like I was there all over again. I am 10 years old, sitting across a mahogany chessboard from my grandfather James. The fire is crackling in the hearth of his study, the room filled with the comfortable scent of old books and pipe tobacco. I've just lost another game. Ethan, who was 12, had beaten me in 4 moves and then swaggered out bored. But grandfather James had set the pieces up again. He was patient. He was always patient with me. I'm staring at the board on the verge of tears, my queen trapped, my king exposed. It's no use, I mumbled, pushing a pawn forward aimlessly. He's always 3 steps ahead. My grandfather didn't say anything for a moment. He simply moved his knight into a seemingly innocuous position. Then he looked at me, his gaze gentle but firm. "You're looking at the wrong pieces, Leo," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You're watching his queen, his bishops, the powerful pieces he parades in front of you. You're so focused on the obvious threats that you're missing the real game." He leaned forward, tapping a finger on the board. "The most powerful move is not always the most obvious one. It's the one they never see coming, the one that changes the entire board. Stop looking at the pieces they show off, Leo. Look for the move they never expect." The memory vanished as quickly as it came, but the words remained hanging in the air of the quiet corridor. Look for the move they never expect. And suddenly I understood. The letter wasn't a useless platitude. It was an instruction. My grandfather hadn't left me a weapon to fight their battle. He hadn't given me a legal document to wave in their faces because that would be playing their game by their rules. A game I would always lose. He had given me something far more powerful. He had given me permission. Permission to stop being the quiet, invisible boy in the corner. Permission to make a move so unexpected, so out of character that it would shatter their entire game board. The key wasn't for a box I needed to open tomorrow. The key was the proof. It was the symbol of the truth. And the courage he spoke of. It wasn't some abstract concept. It was the raw, terrifying, exhilarating decision to walk back into that room, not as a victim, but as a player. To stop reacting and start acting. To make a move of my own. The footsteps of the guards were just outside the curtain now. I could hear their low voices conferring. In a few seconds they would find me. My father's pen was still hovering, a guillotine waiting to fall. I took a deep breath. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but now it was mixed with something else, a flicker of purpose. A spark of my grandfather's faith in me. I smoothed out the crumpled letter, folded it carefully, and placed it and the key into my jacket pocket. They were no longer a mystery. They were my armor. Ethan expected me to run. My father expected me to be silent. The whole world expected me to accept my fate. It was time to show them the move they never saw coming. Taking a final, steadying breath, I shoved the curtain aside and stepped back into the lion's den. The bright lights of the ballroom were a physical shock after the dim corridor, a sudden, overwhelming assault on my senses. For a moment, I was blinded, a ghost caught in the headlights. The two security guards who had been poised to enter the corridor stopped dead in their tracks, their professional composure momentarily shattered by the sheer audacity of their target walking directly toward them. I didn't slow down. I didn't flinch under their hostile glares. I walked right between them, my shoulders squared for the first time in my life, my eyes locked on the stage like a heat-seeking missile. My father's pen was still hovering over the document, a bird of prey about to strike, and every step I took was a beat in a frantic drum solo counting down to the end of my world or the beginning of a new one. My sudden reappearance did not go unnoticed. A ripple of confusion spread through the guests closest to me, a murmur that grew as I pushed deeper into the room. People turned to stare, their faces a mixture of curiosity and annoyance at this disruption to their perfect evening. But it was Ethan who reacted first, his predator's instinct sensing a shift in the dynamics of the hunt. He had been watching the corridor, a smug, confident expression on his face, clearly expecting me to be dragged out in disgrace. Seeing me walk back in and with such an unnerving, unfamiliar purpose, wiped that satisfaction clean away. A flicker of genuine surprise, quickly followed by a dark wave of annoyance, crossed his features. He said something short and sharp to our father, who was still blissfully unaware, and then started down the short set of stairs from the stage. He moved with a predatory grace, a wolf descending from his perch to deal with a stray sheep that had forgotten its place. He met me in the exact center of the room, a deliberate and theatrical choice positioning himself directly in my path. He was a human roadblock, a physical manifestation of every obstacle that had ever stood in my way, designed to halt this foolish last-minute rebellion. He was taller than me, broader, his expensive suit doing nothing to hide the athletic power in his frame. He folded his arms, a classic power stance, and looked down at me with an expression of weary condescension, like a parent about to scold a toddler for throwing a tantrum in a crowded store. "Okay, I'll bite," he said, his voice a low, mocking drawl. A private performance just for the two of us. Though the nearby guests were now openly staring. "What are you trying to do, little brother? Make a scene. Are you going to go up there and cry to Daddy that he didn't give you a new toy for Christmas?" He gestured vaguely toward the stage, with his head a contemptuous flick. "This is embarrassing, Leo. Even for you. You're a grown man, for God's sake. Whatever pathetic little drama you've cooked up in that head of yours, it ends now. Go home. Sleep it off. We'll all do you the favor of pretending this never happened." His words were poison darts, each one dipped in a venom distilled from a lifetime of casual cruelty. They were designed to cut, to remind me of my place, to trigger the familiar paralyzing shame that had always kept me in line. And a part of me, the old me, the weak me, wanted to flinch. I felt the familiar heat rise in my cheeks, the instinct to lower my eyes, to apologize, to simply dissolve into the background as I had always done. But then I felt the solid, reassuring weight of my grandfather's key in my pocket. It was a small piece of metal, but it felt like an anchor in a raging sea. "Get out of my way, Ethan," I said. My voice didn't sound like my own. It was quiet, but it was hard. It was steady. It didn't waver, and for the first time I met his gaze and held it. Ethan's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise, and he let out a short, humorless laugh that was pure performance. "Get out of your way," he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "Or what? What are you going to do, Leo?" He took a deliberate step closer, invading my personal space, forcing me to tilt my head back to look at him. His voice dropped to a menacing whisper, the public facade falling away to reveal the cold, hard bully beneath. "Let me make this very clear for you. You are a failure. You are a rounding error in this family's balance sheet. You are a footnote in our story. You have nothing. You are nothing. Now you are going to turn around and walk out that door before you completely humiliate yourself and what's left of this family's dignity." He saw it then, the defiance in my eyes, the refusal to back down that was as new to me as it was to him. His expression hardened. The condescending mask slipped entirely. This was no longer about family image. It was about power. It was about putting me back in my box. "What did that old fool Hayes give you?" he hissed, his eyes darting to my jacket pocket, which I now instinctively covered with my hand. Some pathetic letter from a sentimental old man who lost his mind years ago. "Give it to me." He lunged forward. His movement was a blur of expensive wool and aggression. His hand shot out not to push me, but to reach into my pocket to snatch away the last shred of hope my grandfather had given me. It was an act of supreme violation, a final contemptuous assertion of his right to take whatever he wanted from me, be it my dignity, my inheritance, or the last physical token of my grandfather's love. He wasn't just trying to stop me. He was trying to strip me bare to prove once and for all that I owned nothing, not even the secrets in my own pockets. And in that moment, something inside me, a dam that had been holding back a lifetime of repressed anger, of swallowed insults, of silent resentment, finally burst. I didn't think. I reacted. All the years of being pushed aside, of being made invisible, of being the butt of his jokes, of watching him receive the love and approval I so desperately craved, all of it coalesced into a single explosive volcanic movement. As his fingers brushed against the fabric of my jacket, I brought both of my hands up and shoved him. I shoved him with all my strength right in the center of his chest. It wasn't a calculated move. It was pure, raw instinct. I had never laid a hand on my brother in my life. The shock of the action, the feeling of his solid chest meeting my palms, was as surprising to me as it was to him. I had expected him to barely move, to laugh it off as a pathetic attempt at rebellion. But I had put more force into it than I realized. I had put the force of 25 years of frustration, of quiet agony, of silent screams into that one push. Ethan, who had built his life on a foundation of unshakable confidence, was caught completely off balance. He stumbled backward, a look of pure comical disbelief on his face. His arms flailed, reaching for something, anything, to steady himself. He was like a proud statue toppling from its pedestal in an earthquake. One clumsy step back, then another, and then his back connected with the towering, elegant pyramid of champagne glasses that had been so meticulously arranged for the celebration. The sound was apocalyptic. It wasn't just a crash. It was a symphony of destruction, a multi-layered explosion of noise that ripped through the ballroom. First there was a sharp, crystalline crack as his body made impact. This was followed instantly by a percussive, cascading roar of hundreds of glasses shattering against each other and then against the hard marble floor. It was a sound that echoed through the vast, opulent space like a gunshot, a sound of pure, unadulterated chaos. A tidal wave of golden champagne and white foam erupted from the wreckage, splashing across the polished floor and drenching the expensive shoes and designer gowns of the nearest guests, who shrieked and leaped back. The magnificent tower, a glittering symbol of the evening's perfect opulence and Ethan's triumph, collapsed into a glittering, chaotic, bubbling ruin, and then absolute deafening silence. The soft orchestral music ground to a halt. The low hum of polite chatter died as if a switch had been flicked. Every single person in that room, all 300 of them, froze. Every head turned. Every pair of eyes in that vast, opulent space was now fixed on the two of us. On me standing there, breathing heavily, my hands still slightly outstretched, tingling from the impact. And on Ethan, who was sitting stunned amidst the glittering debris and the spreading sticky puddle of champagne, his $1,000 suit soaked his hair, dripping his face, a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. The spotlight, which had been shining so benignly on my father, now felt like it was burning a hole in my own skin. I was no longer invisible. I was the epicenter of a disaster, the saboteur of my brother's coronation. On the stage, I could see my mother's hand fly to her mouth, her face pale with a horror that was almost theatrical. My father's expression was thunderous, a storm of pure, unadulterated fury gathering in his eyes. He looked like he was about to personally leap from the stage and throttle me with his bare hands. In that deafening silence, standing in the wreckage of their perfect party, I realized there was no going back. I had done more than just push my brother. I had shattered the illusion of the perfect family. I had broken the unspoken rules of silence and submission that had governed my entire life. I had finally, irrevocably made a scene. The old Leo would have been horrified. He would have been rushing to apologize, babbling incoherently, crumbling under the weight of hundreds of judgmental stares, his shame a tangible, crushing force. But as I looked at my brother sitting in the ruins, looking not like a king, but like a drenched and bewildered child, and then at my father on the stage, his face contorted with rage, I didn't feel shame. I didn't feel regret. All I felt was the cold, hard certainty of the key in my pocket, and the echo of my grandfather's words in my soul. The game board was shattered, and it was my move. The silence was a physical thing, a heavy, crackling blanket that smothered the entire ballroom. For a few heartbeats, the only sound was the fizzing of champagne dying on the marble floor and the distant, panicked gasp of a guest. In that frozen moment, I was the undisputed center of the universe. 300 pairs of eyes were locked on me, their expressions a kaleidoscope of shock, confusion, and outrage. They weren't just looking at me, they were truly seeing me for the very first time, and they saw a saboteur, a madman who had just shattered the perfect illusion of the Sterling family. My brother Ethan was still sitting in the wreckage, his face a perfect picture of stunned disbelief. And on the stage, my father's face was a thundercloud of pure, unadulterated rage. This was it. This was the opening. The chaotic, messy, and beautifully imperfect opportunity my grandfather had told me to look for. The move they never saw coming. The old Leo would have been paralyzed by the attention, crushed by the weight of their judgment. But the key in my pocket was a cold, hard reminder of my purpose. I had their attention. Now I had to use it. While the security guards were still trying to process the scene, their brains struggling to reconcile the sight of the heir apparent sitting in a puddle with the quiet, insignificant younger brother who was still standing, I moved. I put one foot in front of the other, my shoes crunching softly on shards of glittering glass. I started walking toward the stage. It wasn't a sprint. It was a deliberate, determined march, a slow, inexorable advance that parted the sea of shocked guests. People who had never given me a second glance now scrambled to get out of my way, their eyes wide as if I were a bomb about to detonate. I could feel their stares like physical touches, hot and probing. I passed my mother, who was being consoled by another woman. Her face, when she looked at me, was not filled with concern for a son who had clearly snapped. It was filled with a look of pure, unmitigated social horror. In her eyes, I wasn't having a breakdown. I was committing an unforgivable sin against our family's reputation. I was ruining her party. The silent condemnation in her gaze was more painful than a slap, but I didn't let it stop me. I kept walking. I reached the short set of stairs leading to the stage. 2 steps. That's all that separated me from the man who had controlled my entire life. My father had recovered from his initial shock, and his face was now a terrifying mask of fury. The vein in his temple pulsed violently, and his hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. He saw me approaching, and a look of utter disbelief crossed his face as if he couldn't comprehend the audacity of my actions. I climbed the 2 steps. Now we were on the same level, equals for the first time in our lives. We stood face to face, the podium between us. The document, the instrument of my final disinheritance, was still lying there. A few drops of champagne splattered across its pristine surface. His eyes were blazing, promising a level of retribution I couldn't even imagine. And in his hand he was still clutching the fountain pen, his knuckles white. It was the scepter of his kingdom, the symbol of his absolute power. And I took it from him. My hand shot out, and my fingers closed around the cool, smooth barrel of the pen. It happened so fast he didn't have time to react. For a split second our fingers touched, and it felt like an electric shock. I pulled, and he instinctively held on, his eyes widening in disbelief that I would dare to physically challenge him. A guttural roar ripped from his throat, a sound of pure primal rage that silenced any remaining murmurs in the room. "Are you insane?" he bellowed, his voice cracking with fury. He was no longer the poised CEO. He was just a man whose absolute control had been stolen from him. "Security." He screamed, his face turning a blotchy, alarming shade of red. "Get him out of here now!" But I had the pen. I didn't throw it. I didn't break it. I simply placed it gently on the podium, well away from the document. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out the cream-colored envelope. My hands were shaking, but my purpose was clear. I ignored the 2 security guards who were now bounding up the steps, their faces grim. I ignored my father's continued shouting. I carefully unfolded the single sheet of paper my grandfather had left for me and placed it on the podium. The room was so quiet that my own breathing sounded like a storm. I leaned toward the microphone, the same one my father had used to declare me a non-entity just minutes before. My voice, when it came out, was surprisingly clear, imbued with a strength I didn't know I possessed. It carried across the silent, stunned room, every word landing with the weight of a hammer blow. "They think my legacy is a company," I read, my eyes tracing my grandfather's powerful script, a collection of buildings and bank accounts. "They are wrong. I paused, letting the words sink in. My father had stopped shouting momentarily, stunned into silence by my actions. I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. My greatest asset isn't in the Sterling Industries portfolio. It is in your courage. The courage that has been tempered by silence, tested by disrespect, and strengthened by adversity. This is your inheritance. Now use it. I finished reading and looked up. The room was utterly still, the guests captivated by this bizarre, unexpected turn of events. For a moment, a fragile, hopeful moment, I thought I might have broken through. I thought the truth spoken in my grandfather's own words might be enough. Then the laughter started. It began as a low chuckle from Ethan, who had finally picked himself up and was now stalking toward the stage, his suit dripping his face a mask of cold fury. Courage. He sneered the word, dripping with venom. "Is that what you call this little tantrum?" Then my father joined in. It wasn't a laugh of genuine amusement. It was a cruel, booming, dismissive sound designed to regain control, to reframe the narrative. It was the laugh of a man swatting away a fly. A poem, he roared, turning to the audience. My father lost his mind at the end, and this pathetic boy thinks a sentimental poem gives him the right to ruin our celebration. He's delusional. That was the cue the guards needed. Their hesitation vanished, replaced by brutal efficiency. A hand like a steel clamp locked onto my right bicep. Another grabbed my left arm, twisting it behind my back. They were professionals, and I was no match for them. They began to drag me away from the podium, away from the microphone, away from my one and only chance. "No," I yelled, struggling against their iron grip. "You don't understand. There's a key." But it was no use. My voice was drowned out by my father's laughter. He picked up the pen again, a triumphant smirk on his face. He looked down at me as I was being forcibly removed from his stage, from his life, and his eyes were full of a cold, victorious light. He had won. The rebellion was over. The brief, insane hope that had flared within me was extinguished, replaced by the cold, crushing certainty of failure. They were dragging me toward the exit, and my father was about to sign the papers. I had lost. Defeat was a physical sensation. It was the rough tweed of the security guard's jacket scraping against my cheek. It was the crushing pressure of his fingers digging into my bicep, a brutal grip that promised bruises. It was the helpless, dragging feeling of my expensive dress shoes scuffing uselessly against the plush carpet as they hauled me from the stage like a piece of trash. My brief, insane rebellion was over. I had made my move, and I had been checked in the most public and humiliating way possible. Hope, that fragile, beautiful thing that had flared so brightly in my chest just moments before, was now a cold, dead ash. All that was left was the hollow, echoing certainty of my failure. I risked one last look over my shoulder. The scene was a nightmare come to life. My father Robert stood at the podium, his face a mask of triumphant fury. He had weathered the storm. He had won. He was holding the fountain pen again, not with hesitation, but with a renewed, vicious purpose. My brother Ethan was climbing the steps to the stage, a cruel, victorious smirk playing on his lips, his soaked suit a minor inconvenience in the face of his ultimate victory. The audience, which had been a sea of shocked faces, was now settling the collective narrative already forming in their minds. The stable, brilliant heir had been challenged by his unhinged, pathetic younger brother, and order had been rightfully restored. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and scorn. I was no longer a threat. I was just a sad, temporary diversion. The guards were dragging me toward the grand exit, their movements efficient and impersonal. In a few more seconds, I would be thrown out into the cold night, a final, definitive expulsion from my family, my home, and my own life. My father raised the pen. I saw the black nib glint under the stage lights as it descended toward the paper. This was it. The final, irrevocable stroke that would legally erase me from existence. I closed my eyes, unable to watch the final nail being hammered into my coffin. And then it happened. A sound sharp and electric cracked through the ballroom. A loud jarring pop, like a giant flashbulb exploding, echoed from the speakers. It was followed instantly by a deep electronic hum that vibrated through the floor. I opened my eyes. Every head in the room, including my father's, snapped toward the massive LED screen that formed the backdrop of the stage. The sleek corporate logo of Sterling Industries, which had been glowing there all evening, was gone. The screen was now completely unnervingly black. My father, his pen hovering a mere millimeter from the page, spun around. "What is this?" he roared, his voice filled with fury at this technical incompetence. "Get that back on. What is the tech crew doing?" But no one answered. The black screen held for a long, pregnant second, sucking all the air and sound from the room. And then it flickered to life. It wasn't the company logo that appeared. It was a face. An old, familiar, and utterly impossible face. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom, a soft, unified sound of hundreds of people inhaling at once. The security guards holding me froze, their professional duty momentarily forgotten in the face of this inexplicable event. Their grips loosened. I stumbled forward a step, my eyes glued to the screen. It was my grandfather, James Sterling. He was sitting in the deep, worn leather armchair from his study, the one that always smelled of pipe tobacco and old books. He wasn't the powerful titan of industry from the portraits that lined the company headquarters. He was the man I remembered from the end, frail. His body thinned by illness, a thick woolen blanket draped over his legs. But his eyes, magnified slightly by his glasses, were as sharp and clear as they had ever been. They were filled with an undeniable intelligence, a profound weariness, and a deep, unshakable resolve. And he was looking directly into the camera. He wasn't looking at a lens. He was looking at us. He was looking at my father. He was looking at me. It was a message in a bottle sent from the shores of the afterlife, and it had just washed up at the feet of his entire world. My father stared, his face draining of all color, his mouth hanging slightly open. The pen slipped from his nerveless fingers and clattered onto the podium. Ethan, halfway up the stairs, stopped dead, his smug expression melting away into a mask of pure, bewildered shock. Then my grandfather spoke, his voice slightly raspy with age but amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system filled every corner of the vast room. It was not the voice of a ghost. It was the voice of absolute authority. "If you are watching this video," he began, his voice calm and measured, "it means that my son Robert has done exactly what I feared he would do." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the stunned silence. My father looked as if he had been physically struck. "It means," my grandfather continued, his gaze unwavering, "that he has mistaken arrogance for talent, that he has confused bluster with strength. He was prepared to stand on this very stage and hand over an empire, my life's work, to a carbon copy of himself." He looked away from the camera for a moment, a flicker of deep, profound sadness in his eyes. He looked down at his own hands resting on the blanket. "I spent a lifetime building Sterling Industries, not just as a company, but as a legacy. A legacy is not about profit margins or stock prices, Robert. It is about character. It is about integrity. It is about the quiet strength to do the right thing when no one is watching. These were the lessons I tried to teach you, lessons I fear you have forgotten." He raised his eyes back to the camera, and now they were filled with a steely resolve. "For years I have watched. I watched as one of my grandsons was celebrated for his every achievement, his ego inflated, his character unchecked, and I watched as my other grandson was belittled, ignored, and pushed into the shadows. I watched as he was tested not by me, but by the casual cruelty of his own family. You all saw a failure, a disappointment, but I saw something else. I saw a quiet resilience. I saw a humility that was mistaken for weakness. I saw a heart that refused to become hard despite every reason to do so. I saw a diamond being formed under unbearable pressure. Tears were now streaming down my face, hot and silent. The guards were no longer holding me. They had stepped back, their faces a mixture of awe and confusion, their duty forgotten. I stood there, untethered, watching the man I missed more than anything in the world speak the words I had waited my entire life to hear. He was not just defending me, he was validating my entire existence. My grandfather leaned forward slightly in his chair, his voice dropping, becoming more intimate, more personal, as if he were speaking directly to me. "You see, I knew that true leadership isn't forged in the spotlight of constant praise. It is forged in the darkness of adversity. It is earned through the quiet dignity of enduring the unendurable. It is found in the courage to remain kind in a world that has been anything but." Then his gaze shifted, becoming hard and direct again, a final judgment delivered from on high. He was looking directly at my father, and in his eyes I saw not anger, but a deep, profound disappointment that was 1,000 times more devastating. "You have spent this evening preparing to sign a piece of paper," my grandfather said, his voice ringing with a final, unshakable finality. "A document you believe holds the key to the future of this family. You are wrong." He let that statement hang in the air, a death knell to my father's authority, a public dismantling of his power, my true legacy, my grandfather declared, his voice echoing in the silent, cavernous ballroom, is not in those papers. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, a perfect vacuum where sound and motion had ceased to exist. My grandfather's face, projected 20 feet high, held us all captive. He was a specter at his own son's feast, a ghost who had returned not to haunt but to pass judgment. My father Robert stood frozen at the podium, his face a ghastly ashen color. He looked like a man who had just seen his entire life revealed as a lie. Ethan, a few steps below him, was equally paralyzed, his earlier rage and mockery replaced by a dawning, slack-jawed horror. They were statues carved from arrogance, and now they were beginning to crack. On the screen, my grandfather took a slow, deliberate breath, the sound filling the silent room. It was the sound of a man gathering his strength for a final, devastating blow. For many months, James continued, his voice resonating with a deep, sorrowful authority. I have been a silent observer in my own home, in my own company. I was ill, yes, but I was not blind. I watched as my son, my own flesh and blood, began to treat Sterling Industries not as a legacy to be nurtured, but as a crown to be seized. I saw his greed, and I saw the arrogance he instilled in his chosen heir. I saw their plans, heard their whispers. They spoke of liquidating assets, of hostile takeovers, of turning a company built on a lifetime of handshakes and integrity into a soulless machine for profit. They were preparing to tear down the house I had spent my entire life building just to sell the bricks. He paused, and the camera seemed to zoom in, slightly capturing the profound disappointment in his eyes. I realized then that I could not leave my life work in the hands of a man who no longer understood its soul. To do so would have been the greatest failure of my life. So I made a decision, a difficult, painful, but necessary decision. My father flinched, a small convulsive jerk, as if my grandfather's words were physical blows. 6 months ago, James declared, his voice clear and sharp as breaking glass, acting through my trusted legal counsel, Mr. Hayes. I began to sell my assets, quietly, discreetly. I sold my entire controlling interest in Sterling Industries, every last share. A collective audible gasp rippled through the audience. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. My father swayed on his feet, one hand gripping the podium to keep himself from collapsing. The company wasn't his to give. It hadn't been for months. The entire celebration, this grand coronation, was a sham. A farce built on a hollow foundation. The proceeds from that sale, my grandfather went on, his voice a relentless tide of truth, along with my entire personal fortune, my properties, my investments, everything of tangible value that I owned in this world, was liquidated. And all of it, every single dollar, was transferred into a newly created private trust fund. An entity with a single legally binding directive known only to me and to my most trusted advisors. The room was now so quiet I could hear the frantic, panicked beat of my own heart. I finally understood. The key, the trust, the courage. It was all a single brilliant posthumous chess move. A checkmate planned from beyond the grave. On the screen, my grandfather looked directly at my father, and then his gaze shifted as if he could see Ethan standing just below. The look in his eyes was not one of anger. It was one of pity. A deep, profound pity that was more damning than any rage could ever be. The company that you, Robert, were about to so generously bestow upon your son James, said, his voice now soft, yet carrying an immense crushing weight, is in fact nothing more than an empty shell. A name on a building, a brand with its heart and its value ripped out. The power you thought you were transferring is an illusion. The throne you were fighting over is made of dust. He let the words hang in the air, a final, brutal epitaph for their ambition. Then he looked at me. Through the camera, through the screen, through the hundreds of people separating us, his gaze found mine. And in his eyes I saw all the love and faith I had starved for my entire life. The real power, he declared, his voice swelling with conviction, the real assets, the entire Sterling fortune and the future it represents is now in the hands of the one person I have tested over these long, difficult years. It is in the hands of the one who was given nothing and so learned the value of everything. The one who endured scorn and still showed kindness. The one who was called a failure and in doing so was forged in a crucible that his brother could never have survived. He raised a single frail finger, pointing not at the camera but threw it at me. The key that is in Leo's pocket right now will unlock it all. It is the sole key to the trust that holds the future. Because you see, my last will and testament is very, very simple. His voice rang out a final triumphant proclamation of truth that shattered the last vestiges of my father's and brother's world. My will has only one heir. And with that, the screen went black. The video was over, but the silence it left behind was even more profound. For a long moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The image of my grandfather's resolute face was burned into the back of every eyelid in the room. Then slowly, the hands that had been gripping my arms with such brutal force fell away. The security guards took a half step back, their faces a mixture of awe and fear. They were no longer looking at a troublemaker. They were looking at the single most powerful person in the room. I stood there free, my arms tingling where they had been held. I looked at my father. He was a broken man. The rage was gone, replaced by a hollow, vacant shock. His face was white, his mouth agape, his eyes staring unseeingly at the blank screen that had just pronounced his doom. He had been publicly, surgically, and completely dismantled by his own father. I looked at Ethan. He was a ghost. The arrogance, the confidence, the very essence of his being had been stripped away, leaving behind a pale, trembling shell of a man. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a horrifying new understanding. In his eyes, I no longer saw a pathetic little brother. I saw the man who held the key to his entire world, a world he had just lost. The guests, our friends, our family's entire social circle, were now staring openly, not at me, but at Robert and Ethan. And the looks on their faces were a final devastating verdict. There was no more admiration. There was no more envy. There was only a cold, clinical pity mixed with the unmistakable, delicious scent of contempt for the fools who had been so publicly unmasked. I was no longer in the shadows. I was standing in the center of the stage, the wreckage of my family's lies at my feet. I reached into my pocket and my fingers closed around the cool, solid brass of the key. It felt warm, alive, a conduit to my grandfather's unshakable faith in me. I pulled it out and held it up in my hand, letting it catch the light. It was more than a key. It was my vindication. It was my future. And in that moment, under the shocked and silent gaze of the entire world, I knew with a certainty that filled every fiber of my being that I had won. I left them all behind in the wreckage of their own making. I didn't wait for the apologies that would never come, nor did I stay to witness the full extent of their social implosion. I simply turned my back on the silent, stunned crowd, on my broken father and my hollowed-out brother, and walked. I pushed open the grand doors of the ballroom and stepped out onto the wide stone terrace into the cool, pre-dawn air. The night was almost over. A faint, pearly gray light was beginning to bleed into the eastern sky, chasing away the last of the deep, inky blackness. The city was still asleep, a quiet, sprawling giant below me. The air was clean and crisp, a welcome antidote to the suffocating, perfume-choked atmosphere of the party. I took a deep breath and then another, filling my lungs, feeling the cold air cleanse the last remnants of fear and anger from my soul. It was over. The battle was won. I was no longer the failure, the footnote, the ghost at the feast. The labels they had branded me with had been burned away in the fire of the truth. I looked down at the city, at the endless rows of sleeping buildings, and for the first time I didn't feel small or insignificant. I felt a quiet, profound sense of peace, a feeling of finally truly belonging to myself. The heavy doors opened behind me, but I didn't flinch. It was Mr. Hayes. He walked over and stood beside me, not speaking for a long moment, the two of us just watching the day being born. He looked tired, the frantic energy from before replaced by a gentle paternal warmth. Finally, he placed a steadying hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm, a silent acknowledgement of the storm we had just weathered together. "He always believed in you, Leo," Mr. Hayes said, his voice soft in the quiet morning. "From the time you were a boy. He saw the steel in you that everyone else was too blind to notice." He paused, his gaze fixed on the brightening horizon. "You know he didn't give you wealth. Not really. He entrusted you with a responsibility." I turned my head to look at him, at this man who had been my grandfather's most loyal friend and who had just helped me reclaim my life. I understood now. The money, the power, the company, they weren't the prize. They were the tools. They were the test. My grandfather hadn't just given me an inheritance. He had given me a purpose. I looked back toward the horizon where the gray had begun to blush with the first hints of pink and orange. A new day was coming. A new life. "I understand," I said, my voice clear and steady. "It's time to build something that lasts." I stood there watching the sun begin its ascent, feeling its nascent warmth on my face. The key in my pocket felt less like a key and more like a cornerstone, the first piece of a new foundation. The fear that had been my constant companion for 25 years was gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable resolve. A new chapter of my life was beginning, and this time I would be the one to write it. True strength isn't showcased in grand announcements, but forged in silent resilience. Society may value the loud and the proud, but lasting legacies are entrusted to those with the humility to listen and the courage to act when their moment finally arrives. Your worth is proven by character, not applause.